Good evening. It's my pleasure to invite you to a program on Catholic Church, society and culture. The program is presented today in the evening, but we've got also guests from other countries. So welcome everyone. I'm Piotr Bednarski. I'm host of this event, and we are very pleased to speak today to Edward Pentin. Edward is a very seasoned Catholic reporter from Rome, author of a couple of books. One of them is quite important, The Rigging of Vatican Synod Investigation into Alleged Manipulation of Extraordinary Synod of Family. He also wrote very inspiring and informative book on the next Pope. Edward is correspondent also of the National Catholic Register from Rome. He's quite familiar with all the mechanics of the Holy See operations and knows many people in the church. So Edward, welcome very much, and we are very happy to have you in our show.
Thank you, Peter. Nice to be with you.
Before we start the program, I would like to just make a few announcements. This program is produced in cooperation with EWTN Polska, Christian Center for Culture of Mary, our Queen, Lay Catholic Association Przybądźcie Wierni. We want to deliver a good program for our viewers and sharing the insights into Catholic Church and its challenges, its faith, and see with the hope for the future. I will be running this interview with my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski, and we will be supported by Szczepan Bartoszko from EWTN, who is providing IT support, and Łukasz Mirosław, who is supporting us in this program. Following the custom of these programs, I would like to invite you to our prayer in Our Father in Latin, asking good God for the peace in the world, especially in the Ukraine, which is suffering enormous aggression from part of Russia, but also for other parts of the world. So the good God gives us peace. Let's pray also for Holy Father, whose 10th anniversary we have been celebrating, and for the Church. Let us pray.
Pater noster, qui es in
Celis,
celis,
sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua,
sicut
in
in cielo
et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostris,
sic ad nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo.
Amen. Let me pass the floor to my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski, who will start this program. Zbigniew, the floor is yours.
Good evening.
Yeah. Good evening. So we would like to start with asking you to give a brief introduction about yourself, about your journey of life, how you became Catholic, whether you had difficulties, whether you had doubts, detours, if you will, on that road, and how did you become a journalist and an expert on Vatican? So if you could start with that would be very nice.
Sure. Well, I come from Canterbury, which is a very important place in the church, for the church in England, which has been a blessing, really. And I grew up Anglican and was actually confirmed by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the cathedral in Canterbury. So that's where I was born, and that was my background that I grew up with. But after I left university, I started searching. I didn't think the Anglican Church had the fullness of the faith. It always felt kind of diluted. It didn't feel like the true church. And I felt there was something, the truth was elsewhere. And so I went searching for it. I spent a number of years going to free churches and then going to other Anglican churches, but never really finding the truth there. And it wasn't until I went to Africa, and I went to Tanzania, and I got a job teaching English out there for a couple of years, nearly 2 years, back in the mid-90s. And that was a very life-changing event, because I was teaching with German Benedictine monks from the St. Ottilian community in Bavaria. and they'd become missionary monks. They were missionary monks, and they'd gone out to Tanzania and evangelized them about at the turn of the 20th century. So I went there, taught there for a year and a half, nearly 2 years, and then I came back to England, and I believed that the church was the true church was the Catholic Church. I had a strong sense that the Eucharist was valid, it was true, there was the real presence there, and so soon after I came back from Africa, I was received into the church. That was back in 1998. Now, from then, I went into teaching for a bit, also abroad, and then I got a job at Vatican Radio just because I was listening one day when I was in Switzerland teaching there, the Vatican Radio, and I thought what a nice place that would be to work and to use the skills that I had, because I had a background in international relations and journalism. And so I thought it'd be nice to use those, and a master's in theology. So they all seem to come together in that way. So I was very blessed to get a job presenting the news at Vatican Radio for a couple of years. That was back in the early 2000s. And then after that, I went freelance and started writing as a Vatican journalist, covering the Vatican, the Pope, John Paul II at that time. And from then on, stayed in that role as a freelance journalist up until the mid 2010s, 2015, when I started working full-time for the Register. I worked for the Register, the National Catholic Register, for 20 years this year, in fact, as a freelancer first, and then as a full-time correspondent. So that's basically my background in the faith and in my profession.
And can you tell us a little bit about, how difficult is it to be a journalist in Vatican today, and what kind of guiding principles do you have to stick to? How do you sort of avoid the temptation of avoiding sensationalism, of the temptation to provide bad news to attract attention, and on the other hand, there is a pressure to sort of avoid certain information and sort of fall into a trap of complacency and opportunism. How do you navigate these waters, if you will?
Well, my rule of thumb has always been that I'm a Catholic first and a journalist second, and so I've always really taken that as my kind of anchor. The anchor is my faith, and what I find is what inspires my work is my faith. So that is what drives me. That's the sort of, I guess, the rule book that I have is that. So everything stems from that. And if I find there's a story which is of interest to the faith, whether it's good or bad, I think that's something that needs to be told. And so I think that's a story that's worth reporting. That's always been my rule. But and up until the pontificate of Pope Francis, it was always quite straightforward, in the sense that when it was John Paul and Benedict, it was the great thing about Catholic journalism, at least then, was that it was a kind of evangelization, and that's why I wanted to go into it, was because I felt it was, excuse me, I felt it was a kind of means of evangelization. And when you're reporting what the Pope was saying, especially Benedict, because he was, John Paul was coming to the end of his years at that time, but Benedict was such a strong teaching Pope who, as you know, he was a great theologian, and just to report on his homilies and his writings was a real joy, I have to say, because you were transmitting the truths of the faith in a very interesting way, because it was the Pope that was saying it. So I very much enjoyed that. It was a very different time, as I say. And then Pope Francis came along, and very interesting, of course, but interestingly, although the Pope wanted the church to be less self-referential and less inward-looking, from a journalist perspective, because of all the controversies that have kind of come up during this pontificate within the church, that it's become very much a sort of internal journalism, looking into the church, looking at the unfortunately, the politics that's gone on, the divisions, the real turmoil that we've had in the past 10 years. And that's kind of been unfortunate, I think, just from my own perspective as a Catholic journalist, because you're not sort of looking outwards and trying to bring the faith to the world. It's all being taken up by internal wrangles and factions and division. So that's really how it's changed over the years. But it's been, but you asked how to avoid the sensationalism. Well, that's something that I've tried to avoid, and I think it doesn't help anyone. But unfortunately, there's been so much news which has been quite shocking. I mean, there's been lots of scandals and so forth, which I think do need covering, because I think these last 10 years, I think the grace of the last 10 years has been the fact that it's been so revealing the last 10 years. And I think that's beneficial, because I think if the church is to be truly reformed and to become again a real strong instrument of evangelization and salvation, then those issues need to be brought out in the open and dealt with. So there's a positive side to all of that internal, inward-looking sort of perspective, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the scandals and the difficulty of sort of handling this situation. Do you experience a lot of pushbacks when it comes to discussing the contentious subjects of today? So do you experience any difficulties when speaking about issues like euthanasia, abortion, mandatory vaccinations, climate change? Because the Vatican seems to be taking positions on some of these, and I guess you are in contact with many people who are taking these positions. So do you experience that pushback?
Yes, well, not on all of those issues. Some of them, yes, because I from what I hear and the kind of perspective that I have, I think on some issues, the Vatican has taken perhaps a rather blinkered view. For example, there was a conference on climate change, a big conference with Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, who came to the Vatican. And it was, there were lots of experts there talking about climate change and so forth. And I was quite shocked how those who had a dissenting view or just didn't agree with the sort of consensus, the alleged consensus that we had then, were not allowed into the hall to discuss the points, the very important points they were. And so I thought that was a problem. And then again, you had the vaccination issue. That's the more recent one, where you had the Pontifical Academy for Life pushing child vaccination when it was already clear that the vaccines were not 100% safe, especially for young people during the COVID crisis. And so that those are two issues that stick in my mind, where I think one has pushed back and one's got into a little bit of hot water with the Vatican because of it. But I don't think that should deter journalists from doing it. And then, of course, there's the whole coverage of Pope Francis, which is a bit of a tightrope, because none of us want to report criticism of the Pope, but there has been quite a lot of that's happened, and I don't think it's a service to the Church and the truth if that criticism, which is often valid because it's simply reiterating the teachings that Benedict or John Paul or previous popes had said, which have been now seen as contradictory to the Pope Francis's teaching, or the other way around, that I don't think it's right that reporting on those issues are silenced or ignored. So I try to report that. Unfortunately, because that's happened quite a lot over the last 10 years, and because I've been willing to report that, one gets a sort of reputation of being a papal critic, which has never been my intention. But I do feel that if you're to do this job properly, you do have to report those criticisms, because, as I say, I think they're valid, and so do many other Catholics as well.
Okay, and when you report on the things that you quote unquote should not be reporting, do you encounter sort of a backlash, if you will? So we hear about people who are subjected to a suppression of their freedom of speech, who are persecuted because of their freedom of conscience. Do you find difficulties in work because of what you are covering and because you are perceived as a critic of the Pope?
Not really. I think certainly some people won't talk to you because they think you're going to be critical of the Pope, and they're probably very close to him or something, which is a shame because that's not what I'm about at all. I mean, I do try to be as impartial as possible and as objective as possible. But as I say, one has that, if one's built up that reputation, then yes, it does get a little bit difficult at times, but not impossible, and certainly not, it doesn't really stop my work in any major way. So yes, but yeah, there has been some pushback a little bit. But as I say, I think it's important to report on the truth and whether that's good or bad. And unfortunately, I think a lot of I don't want to criticize my colleagues, but I think a lot of the Vatican press corps have tended to go along, as somebody said, rather like sitting in the back of the Popemobile. They just tend to just report the press releases and what comes out of the Vatican without much critical analysis or critical reporting. And I think that's a shame because now when one does report that, one's considered a bit of a troublemaker, which isn't true because you're just trying to report the truth. So yeah, that's the kind of situation we're in at the moment.
Okay, and I'm asking these questions because it seems that in today's world it is more and more difficult to express your opinions freely, and that is true even in the Vatican, and that's part of a bigger picture of something that is similar to a persecution of Christians because of what they believe in. So I would like to ask your perspective from the standpoint of a Vatican reporter, whether you think that Christians right now are being suppressed or their freedom of conscience is violated or they are persecuted in the West, and whether the Vatican is taking an appropriate position to protect them.
Yes, it's a good question. I think it's interesting because under Benedict and John Paul, that was always the case, that it was harder. The challenge was to get these points across, the church's teaching a point across to the world, and you'd get a backlash from the world if you tried it. Nowadays, it's more the internal backlash that you get from the church herself, from other colleagues who are very much supportive of a sort of a more liberal, perhaps worldly view, which is sort of dissents from the perennial teachings of the church. And so, yeah, I think the persecution, as Benedict warned I think it was on his flight to Fatima back probably about 10 or 11 years ago, when he said the biggest problem is the I can't remember the exact words, but something like the terrible persecution that comes from within, and that's what's happening now, and that was before this pontificate. So it's even more pronounced now. But yeah, I would agree that it's quite hard, and there are these attempts to silence, and not just opinion, but as I say, reporting, which is what I focus on, is reporting, not opinion. So even if you're just reporting facts which the opposition, the internal opposition, don't like, it's hard to get that across because they try to shut you down, and of course one should really just ignore that and carry on, which one tries to do.
And on the other hand, when you have the militant secularists, they can express their opinions freely, and it seems like the church is going along with that. It seems like we are going along with the plan to marginalize the church and making into a non-governmental organization. And how does it happen that the church does not protect their own from persecution in the West as well as outside?
Well, yes. I mean, this is a really interesting debate, because you reminded me actually in 2010 when Benedict went to the UK. I don't know if you remember, but there was a strong, at that time, I think because of the Islamist terrorist attacks, there was a big backlash against religion in general. And you had these new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and they really they were very critical of religion, and it was quite hard to engage with the secular world because they were making a lot of ground, and that was a real challenge. But it's interesting because they've sort of faded away, and now you've got, as I say, these strong critics within the church who are now attacking the teachings of the church, which we've held for 2,000 years. And so, yeah, I think that is a change. But just to go back to your point, though, could you just clarify again what you meant by that last point you mentioned?
Well, one of the things is that we are sort of seeing is that the church is not taking a strong position in terms of morals, in terms of values, and we are turning into a charitable organization, into an NGO, if you will, to take care of the social justice. And why is this happening?
Yeah, well, I think what I hear, and I try to stick to what I hear rather than my own opinion, because my own opinion, I'm no expert in church history or anything like that, but I do think that there is has been a general drifting away especially in the last 60 years since the council, from the perennial teachings of the church. There's been a lot of dissent, and I think that largely is rooted in the liturgy, because as you know, you pray as you believe, and you believe as you pray, and I think that is the way that the way that things have gone. And I think it's perhaps not too harsh a observation to say that the church over the last 60 years has sort of moved into a certain apostasy. I mean, not an explicit one, but I think there's been a drift away from the solid teachings of the church. And it's always interesting when you read preconciliar documents, homilies especially, how clear they were, certainly morally. And now you have really what seemed to be, you go to a Vatican conference, and a lot of the interventions tend to be very sociological. They're not really theological. They don't have any real substance in terms of theology and church teaching, but they do sound very sociological. And that seems to have been the sort of drift towards that, and really without, some would say, without faith, without much mention of Christ and the true faith. I reported recently this week, in fact, on an observation that an Italian theologian said that Pope Francis never talks about the crisis of faith. I mean, he has done, but very, very rarely. And you have to wonder why that is, because there is a crisis of faith. And why isn't that being dealt with, especially as it was under John Paul and Benedict, who would often talk about it and try to find solutions to it. Whereas this theologian said his solutions tend to be ideological. They talk about universal fraternity and so forth, which were slogans of the French Revolution. They're not really rooted in the Gospels and the faith so much as a sort of revolutionary political agenda or program.
And you mentioned very briefly that that the changes coincide with the period of the Second Vatican Council. Would you say that it's a correlation in time, or is there a causation associated with that quote unquote apostasy, as you?
Yeah, well, this is the debate, isn't it? I would say this drift actually started long before. In fact, going back to the French Revolution and possibly even back to the Reformation, I think a lot of the drifting away began a long time before, but it's accelerated since the council. And I think the council was. I don't think it was. You can blame the council in per se. I don't think in essence you can say there was anything particularly wrong about it. But I think what happened was it was kind of hijacked. It was made ambiguous, and we saw this sort of this same sort of thing that happened in the synods. But we can talk about that later under Francis. But I think in the council it was kind of yes, it was made to be ambiguous. And then of course there was a whole societal change in the 60s, which added to it. And I think all that led to an acceleration. And then, of course, you had the Reformed liturgy, which, as I say, I think was hugely significant. I think that, and that the abuses that followed in the new liturgy, I think, have been immensely damaging. But that's my own personal view. But I think that is a definite reason for this drift away that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, we do see a lot of abuse. Well, we do see some abuses of the new liturgy, and I guess the question remains open whether it's the change of the liturgy or whether it's the abuses that are causing the damage. Now, I wanted to ask you about the persecution of Christians outside of Europe. There seems to be a very brutal period of persecution of Christians in Africa and some Muslim states, and we do not see the intervention of the Vatican, the diplomacy in protection of these people. I know that the Vatican does not have divisions of the army, but it does have the moral stature. Why do we not see more diplomatic action in protection of the Christians, let's say in Nigeria?
It's a good question. I think overall, the Pope, this pontificate has been rather quiet about persecution. You don't hear an awful lot about it. The Pope doesn't speak so much about it as he does about a lot of other issues. And yet it is very serious. I think it's something like 350 million Christians who are either persecuted or face serious discrimination across the world. So and we are the biggest religious group who are persecuted. So yes, it's interesting, and I'm not sure why that is. I think it's also partly to do possibly with the media. I think the media don't report on persecution perhaps as they should, Catholic or secular. And I think Africa particularly, I think always gets ignored on a lot of issues, not just persecution. So I think that's partly it. And the Vatican, I've noticed over the years, will act often in reaction to what the media does. So if the media makes it a big issue, the Vatican will respond, but it doesn't always respond unless the media makes an issue of it, which is a shame, especially when it comes, of course, to other issues like sexual abuse. But yeah, I think it applies to persecution too. But I don't know why, a good solid reason why the Vatican tends to ignore the persecution in Africa. But yes, it is a very serious problem there.
And I guess the last question on that is we've seen the secret treaty that was signed between the Holy See and China, the People's Republic of China, and there was a hope. We understand there was a hope to place the bishops in some of the sees in China to fill the vacancies and to sort of alleviate the persecution. But it turns out that according to the warnings of Cardinal Zen, those persecutions have become stronger, and that the church is really under a lot of pressure and is being suppressed very actively, not just in China, but in Hong Kong right now. And so is there a realization in the Vatican right now that this agreement is a failure? And is there any sort of understanding that it should be changed, that something should be done about it?
Well, it's interesting because Archbishop Paul Gallagher, who's the Vatican foreign minister, as it was, Secretary for Relations with States, he said only this week with an interview with EWTN about the fact that it wasn't the best time to sign that agreement, and they always knew, he said, that it was never going to be easy, and they were never going to get the best outcome, but they thought they did the best that they could, and they got the best agreement that they could have got. But I think that from his comments, I mean, that was probably the most, the clearest expression of regret, I would say, about the agreement that we've heard so far. Like, usually they tend to talk about how much hope there is from the agreement and how better relations are. In fact, Cardinal Parolin said that this week, the Secretary of State. He said how there's hope now and the relations are constantly getting better. But I don't know whether that's true, and I don't think the facts match that perspective, because as you know, last November, the Chinese authorities appointed a bishop, consecrated a bishop without Rome's permission. Rome didn't want him, but they went ahead anyway, so they ignored the agreement altogether. And I've heard that that's typical of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and that they can't be trusted and they won't honor agreements. And this was all known before, and Cardinal Zen, as you say, warned the Vatican about this for many years, as did others, but they were ignored. And I think the Vatican has gone ahead thinking that they know that this is the best way forward. That's what they believe, and they constantly say that, you know, patience is needed, and that what they have in common with the Chinese authority, the Vatican, is that they both take a very long perspective, and so they're willing to be patient about this. But I think a lot of China watchers take a more, I would say, realist position and say that the Vatican, that the Chinese authorities cannot be trusted. They're a dictatorship. They're out to destroy religious organizations who don't abide by the party, by syncretization, by this assimilation of Chinese culture into society, and that there's really no chance of any kind of solid agreement with the CCP, because it's not in tune with their ideology.
Well, this is not the official position, and it's not even close to the official position of the authorities of foreign policy in Vatican, right? Because we know that the Chinese are trying to actually revise Christianity to give it a China Communist Party face, to worship the leader in the churches, to alter the gospel, and so, you know, in face of all these, it would be a very desirable thing, at least for the faithful in China who are suffering persecution, to have clear message, to have clear moral message from Vatican.
Right, exactly. And I think the argument in favor of the Vatican is that maybe they're doing this behind the scenes, and that diplomatically, for diplomatic reasons, they're doing this privately, but publicly they wouldn't say this because it would just worsen relations and could end up with a rupture of some sort. So I think they're walking a real tightrope, and I think their perspective is that they have to be very careful about what they say. But even so, I think the fact is that we haven't seen much evidence of any improvement in relations, at least publicly. So you have to wonder what is happening behind the scenes and what's being achieved, because publicly what we see is not really showing any advance. In fact, it's sort of getting worse. It is getting worse. And so yes, I think this, as you say, I think the faithful in China would probably benefit from the Vatican being more public in speaking out against synicization and against the human rights abuses and the strong restrictions, ever-increasing restrictions on religious freedom.
Edward, let me a little bit make another step into that area of China and Vatican relations, just to complete the picture. We saw certain reports. I should mention the Pillar and Mr. Flynn, your colleague in profession, who reported that there is a growing impact of China on Vatican. And we know from other sources, from other areas, that China has substantial budgets to influence, to have this kind of impact diplomatic policy through various venues like Confucius Institutes, like buying some politicians, journalists. Do we see certain signs or symptoms of China having impact and influencing Vatican, or it's not really factual?
I don't know if we've got anything tangible to show that China is influencing the Vatican in any significant way. We can sort of put pieces together and say, well, this looks like there must be some Chinese influence, perhaps financial, but there's been nothing, there's been no paper trails or anything that we can say to prove this, show to prove it. But I think it's certainly possible. I think China is, I think just by the fact that it is, becoming, if you like, a superpower, it's certainly wielding some influence over the Vatican. And I think the Pope, as he said, I think he kind of admires the Chinese way of governing. I think he says, I think he said it wasn't anti-democratic, which shocked a lot of people, because obviously there are quite a few people who would disagree with that. And I think he has some sympathy. I think he'd love to make a visit there, and that may be part of it. But yeah, I think it's interesting, the compromises that they seem to be willing to make with China point to some possible interference. And what's interesting too is that this provisional agreement on the appointment of bishops, Nina Shea, I don't know if you know, at the Hudson Institute, she pointed out that these appointments are really letting in, or at least potentially can let in, an infiltration, just like what happened when the Vatican opened its doors to the Russian Orthodox back in the 1960s. Then you got a lot of spies coming in to work in the Vatican and elsewhere. And I think she pointed out that that's becoming a danger too, that you're now getting appointments made by bishops approved by the CCP, who could well become informants or infiltrators. And I think that's a possible potential danger. It may already be there.
Thank you for this clarification. We heard in the past the opinion of the chairman, president of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, our Archbishop from Argentina. He claimed that China introduced fully the social teaching of the church. So it was such a shock to hear that. It reminds us so-called Ostpolitik of Vatican of 70s with Archbishop Casaroli Poggi, who were naive and misled by communists in Central Eastern Europe and made a lot of mistakes here in Poland and other countries. But I know that Vatican diplomacy is very much admires this kind of policy which took place over that period. Any comment on that? Do you see certain parallel between Casaroli and Poggi policies on 70s and nowadays this opening to quite totalitarian regimes?
No, definitely, yes. No, this Ostpolitik has made a comeback under Francis, and I think this sort of general compromise, as I say, and this form of diplomacy is weakening. I think the argument is that it's weakening the church's position, and that it's giving the dictators, in this case China, the upper hand. and it's giving too much away and not getting really anything in return.
Let me turn to another theme which is very important nowadays. This is synodality. My question is, when you observe the evolution of the synodal process, do you have an impression that there is already a predetermined destination of this synod? We see certain pronouncement of Cardinal Gretsch or Cardinal Hollerich or some other members of this close circle of managers, so to say, of the synod, which may suggest that there is already some sort of final conclusion established. Is it misleading observation? Is it wrong observation, or you see certain symptoms which might signal that we are driving into direction which has been already predetermined?
Yes, no, I think the latter, Peter. I think we're seeing a repeat of really all the synods we've had since 2014 with the Synod on the Family, because you've got the people in charge. I wrote about this. You've got all the synod, those who are in charge of writing the working document for the continental stage of the synod, which is what we're now in, are all people of a certain doctrinal persuasion. They tend to be wanting to or in favor of LGBT rights, for example, in the church, acceptance of them, greater acceptance of them in the church and their relationships. And you're also seeing other aspects too, openness to married clergy or women priests among them. One of the people who organized or helped devise the working document, I saw that she's from Burkina Faso, and she's very supportive, I think, of that agenda. The agenda is also of the German synod, at least some of it, and she's now trying to push that in Africa. So you've got a certain makeup of this synod from the top, and you've got Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, who's he's a general relator of the Synod on Synodality, and he's certainly expressed these opinions, and he's got a very prominent role as general relator in coordinating the synod in October. And so he's the fact that these people are involved and taking serious, important, influential roles within the synod, I think, as happened with all the other synods, shows that they're wanting to steer the synod in a certain direction. They may not have the conclusion already there, but they certainly seem to want to be steering it in that direction. And the fact that they tend to be always listening to those groups who do dissent from the church's teaching on these issues shows that that is pretty much, we can be pretty much certain that's the direction they want it to go in.
Mm. You wrote talking about that. I remember that you wrote this book on the rigging of the Synod on Family. Could you recapitulate some key mechanisms which took place at that time? And tell us whether you might expect that this kind of manipulation and maneuvers could take place also during this upcoming synod in Vatican. I talked to someone who participated in Synod on Family, and he was in one of the groups where the chairman of this group protested against manipulation of the synthesis. This was famous. You probably remember that press conference where Cardinal Erdo was put aside, and and Archbishop Forte presented the findings, the conclusions of the group, while these conclusions were not in line with what was discussed. Could you a bit share your observation, what happened at that time, and whether we should draw some conclusions or lessons learned from that?
Yes, well, that relates to the midterm report, which, funnily enough, we've never had again, because I think they overreached in that respect, and they fell on their faces because they tried to push forward this greater acceptance of homosexuality in the church at that time. And they got a lot of pushback especially from African synod fathers and bishops. So I think that was the key attempt back in 2014. But since then, we've had the usual. I think it's quite easy to spot attempts to try to sway the synod and push it in a direction, because, as I say, it's the personnel primarily, the people they choose to run it, and they tend to be always pushing these agendas. In the synod on the Amazon, which looked as though it might change the discipline on married priests, you had Cardinal Claudio Humes, who was a general relator for that synod, and he was famous as a former prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy under Benedict, in fact, back in 2006, was it, or maybe a bit later. He was known to be pushing for married priests, and that was what he was also wanting in the Amazon Synod, but he didn't get his way, which was interesting. But we can talk about that later. But certainly there is this constant push, as I say, along this way of pushing an agenda, and they do it in different ways. It was much more overt in 2014. You had different ways of doing it. As I say, you had the midterm report, but you also had trying to intercept books, which Cardinal Burke and others had written, a book rather, which pushed back against communion for divorced and remarried. That was sort of intercepted and they tried to stop that being distributed to the Synod Fathers. You had other stackings of the deck, as it were, putting people in important positions in terms of governing the Synod who wanted it to go a certain way, and so forth. So we've seen all this before, and now they're getting quite brazen about it. I don't think they seem too concerned about any resistance to it. I think they realize now that a lot of people don't really have a lot of the cardinals don't have the stomach to really resist it at the moment. At least that's how it seems, but we'll see what happens in October.
I mean, for us lay Catholics, it was shocking that some of this dissent organization, like New Age Ministry, which was subject to the investigation of the Congregation of Doctrine of Faith under the Pope John Paul II and Pope John II and Pope Benedict, was put in such a prominent place on the website of Synod of Synodality. We saw Sister Natalie, I don't remember her name, who visited with Sister Gramick in US, and the question was why Courage was not invited, why other Orthodox organization working with people having same-sex attraction were actually eliminated from the picture. We don't understand that, because the Synod was, at least in theory, was open to everyone, but with certain guiding, I would say, certain behavior pushing into one direction. Any comment on that? Why is it so?
Yes. Well, I think this is interesting. I think with anyone who doubts that there's some sort of agenda at play needs to look at the fact that this synod coming up is all about listening. It's supposed to be all about listening to the faithful and to hear what they want. But the ones who are being listened to seem to always be those who are in favor of this agenda, this heterodox agenda, let's say. But rarely you'll get them listening or having any or giving any exposure to those who perhaps, favor apostolic tradition or orthodoxy. Where are their voices? Where's any prominence given to them? If there is, it's very little. It's usually in a couple of paragraphs, but you don't get anything really representative of them. And I think that general hypocrisy, if you like, I think a lot of people see it as that, is a great tell that this synod has an agenda, and they're willing to push it, and under the guise of listening. And it's a false label that they're putting on it, because they're not listening to everybody, and I think that's quite clear.
Right. I mean, for us, it is sometimes clear that if you look at the approach, the methodology of the synod is very kind of horizontal. it opens possibility for discussion and impacting the synthesis, the summary of the synodal process by people who are completely outside the church, people having dissenting views on sexual morality, who reject the church teaching. And therefore, the question is whether this way we can already identify the sensus fidelis, the sense of faithful. Because if we open the door to everyone, and everyone will have impact on the final conclusions of the synodal process, then we might have very contradictory views, which are completely unorthodox, not in line with the 2,000-year teaching of the church. So the question is, when you talk to people in Rome, do they see this kind of, we see as lay people, a certain contradiction in being open and treating all these voices in the same manner, and at the same time claiming that Holy Spirit would guide this kind of conglomeration of various views, which sometimes are completely incompatible.
Yes, exactly. And I was talking to a synod official not long ago, and he kind of admitted that they don't want to listen to those on who support or favor apostolic tradition, because they don't think they'll listen to the voices who are dissenting, who they are listening to. And I also, another factor in all of this, which is, I think, weakens the whole model of synodality in this regard, is the fact that they're willing to listen to people at a time when probably the faithful are the least catechized and the least well-formed that we've ever had. And yet now they're wanting to listen to them and ignore those who are trying to uphold the church's tradition. So, as you say, I think it's destined to go into a heterodox direction, and I think that's clearly what they want, because they're the ones who they're giving most attention to, as I say.
Let me turn to your experience as a reporter, as a correspondent from Vatican. You wrote a book about the next Pope. You also observed how media behave around Vatican. As lay Catholics, we were so surprised to see Pope Francis being interviewed by Eugenio Scalfari, the chief editor-in-chief of La Repubblica, and I can say after each of this interview, new revelations, new shocking news were coming to the secular media, and we Catholics were under pressure because we got this argument: your Pope is proposing something, and you are still behind, and you are this conservative Catholics. Could you clarify why does it happen? Why does it happen that we've got repetitive story of certain interviews which do not bring, I would say, clarity, but even more create ambiguity? Is it the question of the press office of the Vatican? Because there are sometimes corrections, some interviews are removed from the Vatican site. How it works in practice? Because we don't have clue.
Yeah, I think one theory which I tend to agree with, which is that I think this is deliberate and it's aimed at opening up questions to the Church's teaching and to get the ambiguity out there so that the teaching can be weakened. I think that's one theory. Another theory, which I heard from an Argentinian, in fact, which I think has some weight to it, which is the Pope, when it came to Eugenio Scalfari, I think what he wanted to do, apparently, because he was an elderly man like himself, I think he saw it as a challenge. He was an elderly atheist communist who obviously had problems with the faith, and this Argentinian told me that Pope basically saw it as a challenge to try to get him, to convert. Well, I don't know if it's to convert him, but at least to challenge him and have an interesting conversation with him. But I don't think he really cared, the Pope, what came out of it. And I think you saw that because often these very scandalous statements came out, which Francis was alleged to have said, and the Scalfari never took notes and never recorded the interviews. So the Vatican always said, well, we don't know if these are true because he never recorded them. So, but the general confusion and the problems that it caused, the Pope didn't seem to care because the Vatican didn't correct them. The Pope didn't seem to or didn't always correct them. Sometimes they did, but generally they were left hanging, and so the world, which made big headlines in the secular press, tended to swallow them as what the Pope said, and it wasn't corrected. And I think that's a huge break from past papal practice, because popes usually, I think Pope Pius XII was especially careful about saying anything reckless or problematic, because he knew the danger to souls it would present. But you just don't get that with Pope Francis, and I think it's whether he cares or not, who knows. But it does seem as though he's quite free. Maybe he's just trusting in the Holy Spirit that all will be put right. But it does seem to be very reckless and not in accordance with previous papal practice.
Okay. Right. Zbigniew, you're muted.
Yes, I am. You wrote a book about the next Pope, and you wrote about the candidates that are out there. What is the likelihood? What kind of Pope are we expecting to have? What will the next Pope be like, looking at the candidates that you have analyzed?
Well, I think it's, as this pontificate continues, what I hear around Rome is that we're more likely to get a Pope who's going to settle things down. He's going to be a conservative who's going to try to uphold the teachings of the Church in the way that Benedict and John Paul did. So the pendulum will swing back. I have heard that there's turmoil in the College of Cardinals, according to Father Nicola Bux, who's well connected as an Italian theologian who used to be a consultant to the Vatican. He said that there's perhaps half the College of Cardinals are not happy with the way things are going. Cardinal George Pell, before he died, would tell us this in private, that the cardinals increasingly were unhappy, and the majority of them weren't pleased with what's happening, and wanted some sort of resolution where the next Pope calms it down and as I say, returns to very much a more orthodox way of governing the Church and teaching. So that does seem to be the case, and I think there are candidates in the book that I wrote who do stand out as possible successors, based on that theory that it will move back into being somebody who's going to be more conservative.
Okay, and in terms of the nominations for the cardinal position, it seems that there is a trend. Would you confirm that there is a trend in what kind of cardinals are being made, that they are more liberal than the ones that we have? And from that standpoint, is there a chance for outside of the intervention of the Holy Spirit, looking at just the candidates that we have and the cardinals that will be voting, is there a chance of electing a conservative Pope?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I say, I think there's a chance. There's certainly a chance it'll happen. I think somebody said that he was a optimist that the situation in the Vatican could only get worse, because as far as he was concerned, the more worse it gets, the more likely it is we're going to get a Pope who's going to be somebody who's going to really correct everything that's gone wrong. But yes, I think there are candidates there. A lot of people talk about Cardinal Peter Erdo of Budapest as a possible successor, who is a very good canonist, and the need for a good canonist is paramount, I think, for the next Pope, because there's been so much disregard for canon law in the Vatican over the past 10 years, and as Cardinal Pell said, a certain lawlessness has prevailed, and you'll need a cardinal, a new pope who knows how to put all that right. And it could be easily put right, I'm told, by canonists. There's a lot of things that Francis has imposed, probably for the best of intentions, but they've not been done properly, or they've been laws that haven't been needed or been not accepted, and those can easily be changed, apparently.
Mm-hmm. I have perhaps a difficult question. Looking at the last 10 years of the history of the Church, how would you briefly summarize the pontificate of Pope Francis? Does it have a direction, and what is this direction, and how successful is Pope Francis in implementing his agenda, if there is one?
Yes, well, you hear two views on this. One is that he's achieved quite a lot, in the sense that that those who supported him and helped get him elected, their agenda has gone forward. They wanted these synods. It's very much the Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini agenda, which is to have this idea of a sort of permanent synod, a church that's constantly trying to update and get with the times. He said it was already 200 years behind, Cardinal Martini, and that it needed to be updated urgently. And I think a lot of people would say that Francis has tried to do that. But there's another school of thought which says that actually Francis hasn't achieved very much at all. If you compare it to Benedict, who introduced the Morum Pontificum, for example, and liberalized the traditional mass, that was a huge, probably the biggest achievement of Pope Benedict's pontificate. But you haven't really seen anything like that in Francis' pontificate. He hasn't allowed women priests. He hasn't allowed married clergy. Other issues haven't really been set in stone. They've just been talked about and put in footnotes and so forth. Nothing's really concrete, you could argue, has been achieved in that sense, in terms of that agenda. Now, in terms of reform and cleaning up the Vatican, for example, I think there has been progress. I think in terms of financial reform, I think there's been quite a lot of progress in the last few years. In fact, since Cardinal Angelo Becciu was forced to resign, I think as far as I've heard from, according to my sources, that a lot of the old guard who were obstructing financial reform have gone. So that's been a good thing, I think, for Francis and for this pontificate that he's achieved. Yes, so that's basically my assessment.
And that last reform that you mentioned, did it go far enough, if you will? Because it seems that one of the there's a sort of a suspicion that one of the reasons why Cardinal Pell found himself in trouble with the Australian lawlessness is because of his attempt to clean the Vatican finances out. So did the reform go deep enough? Did it go far enough?
Well, yes, I think at least it seems to have done. I think the history will be the judge of it, but I think Cardinal Pell, in fact, was pleased. A lot of the things that he'd recommended, such as more centralized control of Vatican finances, that was put in force. That came into force, I think, was it probably about 2 years ago, or less than 2 years ago. And I remember Cardinal Pell being very pleased about that, because he said that was the suggestion that they'd made to the Pope and to the C9, the group of cardinals helping the Pope to govern or look after the reform of the Vatican. And so, as I say, he was pleased about that. I think, as I say, the old guard seems to have gone. So I think the reforms have been pretty good in that regard. We've got this trial, of course, of Cardinal Becciu and those involved in the London property scandal. We'll see how that goes. Cardinal Pell wasn't happy with the way that was, with the procedure for that, because he thought even Cardinal Berthoud, even though he disagreed with him and had problems with him, he should have had a fair trial, and it didn't seem to be that way. But otherwise, I think the financial reforms are going well. Yes, there was the question of money being sent to Australia. We've never got to the bottom of that, but it does seem as though there was some sort of money stream going to Australia, and various allegations that it went to journalists and lawyers who then put it against Cardinal Pell and got him arraigned and sent back to Australia to face those charges. But that's all, as I say, there's no documentation really to prove this. So, but it does seem to have been that way. But as I say, those old guards seem to have gone. So I think we can probably say that those who are trying to defend their corner and keep the corruption going seem to have been defeated.
Okay, so when we are talking about the agenda of Pope Francis and the introduction of this permanent synod within the church, it seemed at a certain point that the purpose for this was to give a greater independence to the bishops. Do you think that this was actually a goal? And if so, did the bishops get actually a greater independence from Rome, because we see that there are certain moves from the Vatican regarding the suppression of the Vetus Ordo Mass that sort of are taking away a lot of that authority from the bishop.
Yes, well, this is a very interesting point, because you've got, as you say, you've got the decentralization of doctrine, which is what was actually specified in Evangelium Gaudium, the Pope's first apostolic exhortation back in 2013. He actually said this in the document, that he wanted a decentralization of doctrine, so that each bishop's conference can deal with doctrinal issues for themselves. And now we're seeing the fruits of that with the German Synod, of course, and a sort of doctrinal anarchy that's sort of taking shape, where bishops are basically being free to do whatever they want in terms of what they allow. But as you say, when it comes to orthodoxy, again, you see, it comes to orthodoxy and tradition and apostolic tradition. When it comes to those issues, this pontificate takes a hard line, and suddenly centralization is back on the cards. And we even get the First Vatican Council brought up, and papal, the papal infallibility and his right to basically govern as he chooses, and to really lay down the law. And he's done that with the traditional wing of the church. And but yeah, there is that dichotomy between the two. And again, it's favoring the dissent, favoring heterodoxy, and penalizing those who try to uphold the church's teaching and orthodoxy.
And the decentralization of doctrine, this sounds a lot like a Protestant idea, and the result of it might be what we see in the Protestant world, meaning 40,000 different denominations in the United States alone, and a few of them appearing each week. And is this a deliberate move to do this? Because that would lead to a breakup of church into small communities which are completely in disagreement with each other.
Yeah, again, it's hard to say if that's the overall agenda. It does seem to be that way. And it seems to be favoring a sort of Anglican model, if you like, where it's a more sort of democratized church, where the doctrine is fluid and it depends on who has the majority. And as you've seen in the German Synod, that's exactly how it's gone. But it's hard to understand why the Pope would want this, unless he wants. I mean, his argument is that we have to deal with cases where they are, and you have to deal with each case as it happens, and you can't just put one rule for everything. And and that's that's his argument, that you have to basically let the bishops deal with the issues where they are and the priorities that they have within their circumstances and situations. But whether that's how that's going to work out, who knows? But it doesn't. The fruits aren't good so far, because you've got a German church which is threatening to basically go into schism, and the Vatican really at a loss to know what to do, or at least they're not coming down, perhaps as one would expect, hard on them to try to bring them into line. They're just letting them carry on, and who knows how that will end up at the end of it.
I think that the German episcopate was a difficulty even for Pope Ratzinger, that he had a difficulty with them as well. But how likely is it that the German synodal way is going to push the church as a whole in a direction? I know that there is some opposition from the African bishops and from Eastern Europe, for instance, from the Ukrainian bishops,
Yes.
Catholic bishops. So how likely is it that they will be able to push the church as a whole into the direction that they're going?
It's difficult to say how likely it is they'll do it, but I think there are quite strong views that the whole German synod is meant to play into the synod and synodality, and to push the synod and synodality along the same path that the German synod is going along. And this idea that the synod and synodality, and that the Pope and the synod fathers, or those in charge of the synod, are any different to the German synod, is a myth. Now, I don't know if that's true. It's probably going too far, but there is a case to be made that they're both going in the same direction, but just at different speeds. And it's the synod and synodality, perhaps because of the African contingent, those who are more likely to resist it, goes at a slower pace than the German one, but the destination is the same.
And in terms of the influence of various episcopates in Rome, do specific episcopates have influence? Some of them stronger, some of them weaker in Rome. And let's say, what is the position of the German episcopate? Do they have a big influence in Rome?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it's always been a question whether the German money, for example, is what's playing the role here, and whether the rich German church, and it is rich because of the church tax, is allowing it to have this influence. I mean, I've put this to German sources in Rome and so forth, and they often deny it. But of course, they probably would anyway. But if it were true, but it's hard to say. I think certainly the German episcopate is influential, and you've got influential German cardinals like Cardinal Reinhard Marx, who still is president of the Council for the Economy, so that's quite an important role. But you've got others too, and then you've got particular American cardinals who are quite powerful, like Cardinal Blaise Supich in Chicago, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, and you've got Cardinal McElroy in San Diego, who's now also a new cardinal, but he's also wielding some influence. And then you've got, of course, not so much the episcopates, but you've got the Jesuits. The Jesuits, I think, are a hidden but very strong influence in this pontificate, and they shouldn't be disregarded either. Okay, and let me ask you this. Recently, Pope Benedict died, and there was a sort of certain ambiguity while he was alive. Some people were questioning the legality of his abdication and stuff like that. But be that as it may, his presence may have had an influence on Vatican, the Church, and Pope Francis. Did it really have this influence? And if so, what influence his death has? What is going to be expected now that Pope Benedict is gone? What changes should we expect from the Vatican? Yes, well, I think there was an argument that he had a certain moderating influence by the fact that he was there and he was praying for the church. And I think just his presence was tempered Francis's reforms to some extent. But now he's gone. I think you can see that there's a certain stepping on the accelerator, and there has been a certain move towards pushing through reforms. It'll be interesting to see what happens now with the traditional Mass, because there are rumors that there's going to be even more restrictions and clarifications of restrictions coming, which probably wouldn't have happened under Benedict. Of course, it was a surprise that was enforced when Benedict was alive, so maybe his moderating influence wasn't so strong. But yes, I think now he's passed away, I think there is a chance that the reforms will just speed up from now on.
Okay, and another question that we have is regarding the World Youth Days in Lisbon this year. There's been some discussions and some exchange of messages, of letters with the organizers and some faithful here in Poland, for instance, regarding the program of this, and that is the adoption of the UN 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals by the organizers. And when we wrote a letter to the organizers in Lisbon, they said that was something that was desired by Rome, by the Vatican. Do you see that this is a sort of a push that is coming from the Vatican? And two of the things that we sort of highlighted are, number one, the goals that include inclusion of abortion into sexual health and reproductive rights. So that's one thing. So disregard, disrespect for life. And then the other one, there is a cooperating organization that is actively pushing a Buddhist, non-Christian viewpoint there. And both of these seem to be deliberately included in there. Is there an awareness in the Vatican of those facts? And is this driven from the Vatican, really?
Interesting. Yes. Well, you revealed something new to me there. I haven't heard about the Agenda 2030 in the World Youth Day, but that's a very interesting bit of information, because you've seen it over the past 10 years, especially over the past 5 years. And since that meeting I mentioned earlier when President Ban Ki-moon came to the Vatican, you've seen a very much a closer ever alliance with the sort of globalist agenda and the Vatican, and that's only ever increased. And the fact that the Agenda 2030, I mean, the Vatican has frequently expressed support for the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a very a nebulous group of goals, which a lot of them don't seem to be in any way coherent with the Catholic Church's teaching, especially on abortion. There's talk about reproductive rights, which is a code for abortion, and contraception as well, of course. And so the fact that the Vatican is so supportive of these things, and the Agenda 2030, I mean, I've read a bit about it, and the agenda is certainly not Catholic. I mean, it's the fact that it's trying to safeguard the environment is obviously something good, which the Pope supports, but it becomes problematic when I think a lot of that agenda is about population control and so forth, which of course is totally opposite to the Church's teaching. And so I think the fact that the Vatican is teaming up with them for the World Youth Day is just coherent. It's consistent with the agendas that they've backed up until now. So yeah, it's certainly of concern, and I'll look into that, because I think that's a very interesting development.
Yeah, one more thing, if I may. The protection of the natural environment is something that is deeply ingrained into the Christian morality and the Christian attitude to the world. We have to take care of the gift that the Lord has given to us. But it seems that the agenda itself is a form of idolatry when it is actually making nature into a god, for which benefit or for which good we have to sacrifice humanity, and therefore the depopulation agenda comes. And when we saw the famous incident with the idol of Pachamama in the Vatican gardens, it sort of makes it a symbolic sort of gesture in this respect. Would you sort of see this as just a mere symbol, or is there a sort of a deeper meaning in that?
No, I think that's true.
Let me add one additional question here, because we had last time Professor Fastigi, who is a professor of theology at the Detroit Sacred Heart Seminary, and he defends Pope, saying that that was misread, this Pachamama situation, that this was just within the church tradition. Of course, the pictures tell something, perhaps the appearances might say something else. Edward, could you clarify how it was received? Was there really a kind of misunderstanding of Pope's intention in this ceremony, or was there really a pagan element which was properly identified?
Well, I think the problem with the whole Pachamama scandal was not, well, it was what happened, but I think it was the way the Vatican handled it, because there was never any clarity about what those statues were. And then the Pope, of course, himself called them Pachamama. So it's very hard to know, but it does seem as though, I don't know. I mean, I can only report on what one heard and what one saw. And I think there was obviously a lot of concern that was a pagan idol. And it does seem as though the Vatican's approach to the environment has moved away from, as you said, the safeguarding the environment, which is perfectly legitimate church teaching and something that Benedict was very strong about, towards a more sort of pantheistic approach to the environment, which is not, of course, in accordance with the church's teaching, and, as you say, kind of idolatry, and moving on to that sort of environmentalist agenda, which is, and it's actually very anti-human, and it's, human beings are the problem. This is all part of the Agenda 2030 too. It's trying to tell everybody that human beings are the problem and that they need to change, and in some cases perhaps be eliminated in order to save the environment. So it's sort of sacrificing humanity for the environment, which is totally out of keeping with the church's teaching and the perspective that the church gives, the right perspective the church says about the environment. And that seems to be progressively being lost, I think, in the church's approach to the environment, which of course is a very big point of interest for this pontificate.
Edward, we are coming close to the end. Always we ask our guests to share with us the source of hope they've got. Why as Christians, Catholics, they, even in this crisis which we face in the church, they find sources of hope and love, and they try to think positively about the future of the church. Could you share your views on that, and how you, even in this turmoil, how you view the sources of hope?
Yes, well, I think we are, of course, a religion of hope, very much so. And I think this, despite all of the problems and the turmoil that we've had to put up with for the past few years, I think the hope is there, and I think I think we just have to put our trust in God that this is all going to work to the good. I wrote a piece this week interviewing three prominent commentators on the church, and it was all about how these years under Francis have been hugely revealing. And I noticed you mentioned that John Allen talked about Pope Francis' pontificate as like some sort of perestroika, but I'd say it's more like a glasnost, if you like. It's an openness to the church and all its problems. And I don't think that's been deliberate by the Pope and this pontificate, but it's happened. It's been very much a pontificate of revelation. It's been all the ills of the church seem to be coming out, and I think it's mainly because Francis is allowing it to happen. I think there's a lot of heterodoxy that was underneath the surface of the church, and that's all coming out now, because I think those who support that sort of heterodoxy feel that they have the Pope's backing. So with that backing, they've come out into the open, and that I think has been helpful. I think this whole revelation period, although very painful, I think for many of the faithful, I think it is potentially down the line hugely beneficial, because as I said at the beginning, I think if true reform is to take place and the church is to return to being a great tool of evangelization, this all needs to become out in the open, and so it can be dealt with. And that seems to be happening on a major scale. I think you're seeing all kinds of things coming out of the woodwork now.
And let me ask you a question, sort of to tie back to the beginning of our conversation, when you said that you were born and raised as an Anglican, and then you said that certain changes in the church are sort of moving it towards that Anglican model. Is that is it something that sort of moved you away from Anglicanism to Catholicism? And is it a disappointment that the church is sort of moving towards that direction?
Well, yes. I mean, personally, I think it is a disappointment, because the great thing about the Catholic Church is that it is this great body of unified teaching, and that is what makes her so strong and true, that Christ gave us the church to be this great teaching authority, and it can't be some sort of if the law of contradiction can't sort of become the norm, which is what seems to be happening. So yes, I do think that, but at the same time, what the Anglican Church lacked, lacks, is the fact that it isn't the true church, and so it's free to be totally fluid in doctrine, and they can sort of make things up as they go along and compromise, which is exactly what they do. The Anglican Church was born out of compromise, and it always has compromised. The Catholic Church hasn't, and I think even now, I think the core teachings remain totally there. They're not undermined, at least not yet. And I think to give more hope, I think just to say that the church cannot be led into error. We need to believe that. We do believe that, and so that gives us hope. Despite all of the problems that we've had to face, I think we can rest assured that the Catholic Church is not the Anglican Church, and so we can be sure that the church can be guaranteed to continue, and we've been promised that she will. So I think we can pin our hopes on that.
And I guess maybe the pontificate is in certain ways a positive development, because if it uncovers a lot of heterodoxy, it forces us to take a stand. Indeed. And to learn about what the true teaching is. Would you agree with that?
Indeed, yes. I think it's all part of the Lord's providence, that it's this is just my personal view, of course, that it's this is the way the Lord's using it, and that's, as I say, that it'll help the church to reform and help the church in the future, because all of this is coming out into the open, and it's a cleansing, it's a kind of purification, I think, of the church that's going on, which is why they're often painful, and this one is too.
Okay, and would you have a message to the Poles, to us, to people on this side of the Alps? Any reflection of what we should do, what we should not do? Any message?
Well, after speaking,
it's a surprise question.
Well, after talking about the Vatican news and stuff, and my advice might be not to follow Vatican news too much, because I think it can be unedifying and not helpful to one's faith at this current time. So, although it is interesting and it's important to keep up with it to some extent, I would just be careful not to get too engrossed in it and to waste too much time on it, because this pontificate, you know, I mean, for all its benefits and drawbacks, the turmoil will pass, and we'll have, you know, a different time in the future. So all things come to pass, and this one will too. And I think just to waste too much time getting bogged down in church politics and Vatican politics, I think I would advise against, really.
So focus on the faith and our daily
Yes.
practice.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Edward.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
That was very helpful to see you and to listen to your insights and advice. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.